After all the moves Joe Douglas and the New York Jets have made this season and last, who's under more pressure if the Jets don't win this year? Is it Douglas? Is it Robert Saleh? We're going to cover that and a lot more on this episode of Jet Nation Live. I'm Glenn Naughton with Jet Nation Radio and JetNation.com. Be sure to log on to JetNation.com where you can register and become a part of what is the most active Jets message board on the web. It'll be just me this time around, folks. As you saw last week, Dylan Turman and Chris Schubert handled the Thursday live show. That's the route we're going to take for a little bit here. I've got some things going on this side of the pond that are prohibiting my ability to be available every single Thursday and Friday. So now, live when I can do it, when I have a thought, something to share, something on the forums that come to mind, and there's something I've seen not only on the forums at Jet Nation, I've seen it over time on Twitter from Jets fans. This conversation about Joe Douglas's Jets, Joe Douglas's team. When is Joe Douglas going to start winning some football games? Joe Douglas's record since becoming the Jets GM is whatever it is. It's terrible. It's horrible. It's atrocious. Who's under more pressure? Is it Douglas or Saleh if the team doesn't perform this year? God forbid this team doesn't perform this year. I mean, really, everyone's going to have some questions to answer. But in all reality, as far as I'm concerned, this is such a no-brainer. And it's not, I don't even understand how people get to the point where they talk about Joe Douglas and this team's record since he took over as if we could have expected anything else. I mean, yes, could we have expected better quarterback play from Zach Wilson? Absolutely. Obviously, the biggest blemish on his record, a huge busted quarterback, Zach Wilson. However, if you look at the rest of this team, up and down the roster, Joe Douglas has done an incredible job. Top to bottom, 1 through 53. Yes, there have been questions. Yes, there have been mistakes. Yes, there have been things that haven't gone as planned. Of course, there have been bad draft picks. Find me a GM that hasn't made a bad pick. Your favorite GM, your best friend's best GM, favorite team, top GMs, they all miss. Everybody miss. Every GM misses. Everybody in the Hall of Fame who was a GM has misses. Ozzie Newsome has entire classes that were busts. Bill Parcells, Hall of Fame head coach, who every Jets fans love, has some of the worst classes in the history of this organization that rival only John Idzik and Mike McCagnon. Okay, everybody misses. Don't talk to me about this guy to go because he missed here. Everybody does that. It's about, are you hitting? Are you hitting somewhere? Are you hitting often enough to make this team better? And if you look at this team from top to bottom, 1 through 53, from the day Joe Douglas took over till now, it's not even comparable. It's night and day. And don't talk to me about wins and losses for the general manager, because for any of you who have been around long enough, you're well aware of the fact that, and this might be, at least for me as a fan, this is the best example I've seen ever. You know, I've been watching this team, 30 years now? I lose track anymore. But you look at the 1996 New York Jets and the 1997 New York Jets, okay? The 1996 New York Jets, and if you weren't around for it, consider yourself lucky. If you were around for the Adam Gase years, 1996 is the only year, at least in my time as a fan, having started watching this team in 87, 96 is the only year that rivals what Adam Gase produced. It was the worst Jets team of my lifetime. They went 1-15. It was a complete disaster. 1 year later, 1997, that same team wins 9 games, from 1-15 to 9-7 in 1 year. Oh, Glenn, they must have made a ton of moves. There must have been all kinds of personnel additions that made the roster go from 1-15 to 9-7. They must have had a huge upgrade at quarterback. They must have added a game-breaking running back, dynamic receivers, up in that, all top elite defenders. That's the only way you could possibly go from 1 win to 9 wins in one season. Well, let's take a look at the key players. Who was the starting quarterback in 1996? Neil O'Donnell. Who was the starting quarterback in 1997? Neil O'Donnell. Who was the starting running back in 96? Adrian Morrell. 97? Adrian Morrell. Well, who were the top receivers in 96? Wayne Chrebet and Keyshawn Johnson. Must have had much better guys the next year, right? Wayne Chrebet and Keyshawn Johnson. Well, defensively, the leadership must have changed there. The guys at the top of the defense must have been much different. Well, 1996, Victor Green, Marvin Jones, Gary Jones, those were your top tacklers. Well, the next year, who'd they bring in? Victor Green, Marvin Jones. Only name that was different in the top 3 was Jerome Henderson, who was a guy who was brought in to replace Gary Jones. So, yes, of course, there were personnel changes, and we can look at free agency in the draft. New guys came in, but the core, the top guys, the guys who handled the ball more than anybody, the top paid, high profile guys, all the same. And they went from 1-15 to 9-7. Why is that? The head coach. You went from Rich Kotite to Bill Parcells. You improved the coaching so dramatically in 1 year that with essentially the same core and almost the same roster, you went from 1 win to 9 wins in 1 year. The pressure this year is on Robert Saleh. Robert Saleh is the guy. He's got the players now. And this is the thing with Joe Douglas and with any GM. If a team isn't winning, but it's universally agreed upon, whether it's the experts, whether it's the pundits, whether it's the front office guys with other teams, because owners talk, GMs talk, people know what everyone's saying about them. They have some idea. If everybody is looking at the Jets roster and saying, that's a really talented roster, that's a playoff roster, that's a potential Super Bowl roster, and the team goes out and wins 5 games, the head coach is the guy who's in trouble. It's not up to the GM to win the games. It's up to the GM to go out and get the talent. And Joe Douglas right now, listen, let's be honest. Joe Douglas is living largely off of of last year's draft class. Who's whether it's Saleh or Douglas who's under more pressure. Joe Douglas, his first big move, right? Ryan Khalil blew up in his face. Zach Wilson pick blew up in his face. His first full draft class. It's it's in all likelihood the absolute best case scenario for that draft class. The best they can hope for at this point is that Mekhi Becton stays healthy and plays to his ceiling. That gives you a potential all-pro tackle. But it's still a huge question mark at this point. So you can't get ahead of yourself and say that's going to happen. It could happen. Then you might, if you're lucky, you might have a backup safety in Ashton Davis, and you might have a backup corner in Bryce Hall. So that's your ceiling on that Joe Douglas draft class. The floor is that nobody hits. Is that Becton gets hurt again this year, Davis and Hall don't pan out, and they're both gone, and you've got nobody. I don't think there's anybody left on the roster from that class. Technically, Denzel Mims right now, I don't see him hanging around. I don't know how many people watching right now believe that he'll be on the roster come week 1 this year, but I don't think Mims is around. Zuniga's gone, Ryan's gone, Morgan's long gone, Clark retired due to injury, Mann is gone. So yeah, Joe Douglas has had plenty of misses. But as I said at the top, every GM's got misses. Show me where you got some hits. And right now, Joe Douglas, whether we agree or not, we're not going to go down that road again, but whether we agree or not with the compensation of what you gave up to get Aaron Rodgers, you got Aaron Rodgers. You added a Hall of Fame quarterback, and you're adding that Hall of Fame quarterback to an offense that has the reigning Offensive Rookie of the Year, a running back who was on track to win Offensive Rookie of the Year, a returning guard who has shown that he can play both guard spots, both tackle spots, and has the ability also to be an all-pro type player. All brought in and drafted by Joe Douglas. And then, of course, you've got these guys. And listen, Jets fans, understandably so, very excited about that last year's draft class and still talking about it and probably will be for years. But what makes that draft class even more interesting is the guys who didn't play a whole lot showed, for the most part, showed that they belong. Max Mitchell, I've said a million times, not nearly as good as a lot of people make him out to be, but far outplayed his draft slot and showed a lot of potential. For a year 1 guy that people thought wasn't going to see the field, he got on the field in a hurry. And he held his own. He had some good moments, some bad moments. But for where he was drafted and what was expected, he exceeded expectations. Michael Clemens, late round guy, played well on the outside, was a monster against the run. Now the Jets have him pack on 20 pounds and move inside. Now we're going to see him at DT a little bit more this season and see how that works out. Jeremy Ruckert. Listen, I think Ruckert is a guy who's going to end up being a starter at some point this season. Matter of fact, there's a thread on it right now at jetnation.com. A lot of fans are big Ruckert guys. Some people have questions. And there were concerns last year. I'd love to know why he couldn't get on the field late in the year when they couldn't get a first down. I understand there were other guys on the roster, but Jesus, would it have hurt you to throw him a couple passes? You couldn't find the end zone. You went like 2 months without a touchdown. So that was a little bit alarming, a little bit weird, but okay. You can still look at it and say you have Uzama and Ruckert, you have Uzama and Conklin, established vets. They didn't get Ruckert on the field. He gets on the field last week or two of the season, blew some guys up as a blocker, looked phenomenal. Maybe he finds the field this year a little bit as a blocking back. Who knows? But right now, that draft class, as good as it is, as good as it looked in year one, has the potential to be even better, as hard as that is to believe, in year two, and really be a nucleus for this team for years to come. So when I look at Joe Douglas and Robert Saleh, when I see people say Joe Douglas, he's got to win this year, he's got to win some games. Joe Douglas's job is to bring in the talent and to and find ways to keep the talent. Listen, he got a king's ransom for Jamal Adams, who was going to be an overpaid box safety. He got a king's ransom for Sam Darnold, who's already moved on to another team where he'll probably have success because let's face it, they make every quarterback look great in San Francisco. But another topic for another time. But Joe Douglas has made some great moves. He's made some okay moves. He's made some terrible moves. And listen, as the saying goes, right? Sometimes the best moves are the ones you don't make. Let's not forget, and I think I mentioned this one other time on a previous episode. If you want a good laugh, go to your Twitter search and type in the words Quinnen Williams bust. And don't forget, there were a lot of fans. There were a lot of fans calling Quinnen Williams a bust after 1 year, after 2 years, which I said all along. I said, watch this guy's rookie film. Ignore the box scores. Forget the fact that you're in a fantasy league that gives you points for defense and you took Quinnen Williams and you're mad that he's not getting you any fantasy points. Watch Quinnen Williams on film as a rookie. He had some otherworldly reps against some really good players. Even though the numbers weren't there for the fantasy categories, you could see he was going to be a great football player if he just kept working. Specifically, I think the Dolphins in the final week of the season, I did an article on this actually that offseason, I believe, saying, like, look at his final couple games. Quinnen, you're starting to see what he can be. Look at his game against Dallas as a rookie. Quinnen Williams had some monster performances that, again, didn't show, and not even full games, but just monster reps where Quinnen Williams was finding his way. Fans were calling him a bust because he didn't have 10 sacks. And if you remember when Joe Douglas took over, I forget it was Shefty, Rappaport, one of the big two, tweeted out teams were calling the Jets, offering them multiple first-round picks for Quinnen Williams. And Joe Douglas said no. Joe Douglas kept him. Joe Douglas didn't draft Quinnen Williams, but he could have easily taken the route that so many GMs take. He could have walked in and said, this is my team. I got to put my stamp on it. I'm going to get rid of this guy and add myself a couple of first-round picks and build from there. Joe Douglas didn't do that. He saw what he had in Quinnen Williams, kept him around, and now here we are years later, Quinnen Williams likely on his way to being the second highest paid defensive tackle in football. So telling me that Joe Douglas, who is finally, how many years, when it was Idzik, when it was McCagnon, when it was everybody, when this team has been terrible, we always hear the same thing, and rightfully so, calling, yelling, and screaming for the GM. When are we finally going to do it right and just tear it down to the foundation and start over? Why do we get these half measures? We're trying to win, but we're not trying to win. We're using premium picks on these positions, but we're not doing this. And we're tear it all down, start from scratch, build a foundation, and go from there. For years, we've heard fans call for that. You get a GM who finally does it. Joe Douglas comes in, tears it all down, trades the high-profile guys who have any trade value to bring in more picks, depletes the roster. I mean, there was no talent to begin with. Tears it all down, depletes the roster to a team that is probably only going to win a couple of games because he's doing the right thing. And what happens? They go out and they win a couple of games because Joe Douglas was doing the right thing. And the response to that is, look at this guy's record. It's terrible. He's got a losing record. Well, yeah. I mean, if you expected the team Joe Douglas took over to be in the playoffs in a year or two, that's not Joe Douglas's fault. That's your relationship with reality not going so well. That was never going to be a good team that quickly. So, yes, the pressure is on to win this year, absolutely. And the only way Joe Douglas is under any pressure this year is if, and this is something we don't have the access to, we need to know, was Joe Douglas the one saying, this entire offseason is about Aaron Rodgers and we're not going to entertain the possibility of any other quarterback? Or was he willing to go in another direction but being pushed by ownership to only go after Aaron Rodgers? who is now 39. He's getting older. If the Jets start this season and Aaron Rodgers gets dinged up and he misses 8 or 9 weeks and this team misses the playoffs, but Joe Douglas wasn't the guy insisting that it must be Aaron Rodgers, is Joe Douglas accountable for that? I mean, listen, we saw the report out of Indy that Woody Johnson was the guy saying, don't make any offers to anyone. I want Aaron. Aaron's my guy. Aaron, which is fine. Hall of Fame quarterback. I get it. But if you come out this season and he doesn't perform well, are you putting that on Joe Douglas? Hey, Joe, the quarterback that you were directed to get by the owner didn't do well. Well, listen. And again, I'm not here I think Aaron Rodgers is going to break every meaningful record, single season record for the history of this franchise this coming season. I really do. Again, it's as is the case with anything, it's all about guys staying healthy. If this roster stays healthy, Aaron Rodgers is going to shatter every Jets quarterback record. The yards, the completions, the touchdowns, they're all falling this year, courtesy of Aaron Rodgers because Joe Douglas brought him in here. Again, regardless of how we feel about the price that was paid to bring him in. But Joe Douglas came in, tore it all down like everyone said he should do, improved the roster dramatically like everybody wanted him to. But yet there are still those who say he has to win this year. No, he's done his job. Joe Douglas is done. Now listen, that's not to say there aren't some moves to be made. That's not to say there aren't some of the approaches they've taken have been a little bit confusing to me. I'm not here saying, that everything is perfect and Joe Douglas, that this year's roster, there are no questions. There are big questions. There are frustrating questions. I mean, for example, as you know, Connor Hughes tweeted out, and I think we all kind of felt this way. Well, a lot of folks felt this way that Aaron Rodgers was a key piece, but he couldn't be the only piece. There had to be bigger moves made this offseason. Jets really just, it was kind of an Aaron Rodgers offseason with a couple of bit parts. So where you could have had used bigger upgrades, the Jets didn't really attempt to do that. As we said with the draft, I like a lot of the guys they took, but did they take guys who were going to start week one? No. Did that surprise me? Yes. That doesn't mean these guys won't have value. Doesn't mean Will McDonald can't have an impact as a rookie. Doesn't mean Izzy Abanikanda can't be a monster out of the backfield, and I think he will. So I think these guys, a lot of these guys will get on the field. They will play. They will play well. I think one of the questions, too, though, is about, Carter Warren, the tackle out of Pitt. He's a guy that a lot of people said would have been a top 50 pick if not for the injuries last year in college. So talented guy, but he's one of basically everyone. Every tackle on the roster last year missed time. And a lot of guys missed a lot of time. As we know, Mekhi Becton missed the whole season. Max Mitchell missed, what did he play, 7 games? Missed 10, 11 games. Then Carter Warren missed 9 games in college. Dwayne Brown finished the year on IR after starting the year hurt. He signs with the Jets, misses 4 weeks with an injury, plays through an injury all year, and then goes on IR. And he's not getting any younger. So really, with every tackle the Jets have on the roster right now, there are legitimate questions regarding their durability. And as much as we talked about, listen, Aaron Rodgers is that guy. He's that quarterback who, when things are firing on all cylinders, he's getting the ball out in under 2 seconds, and pass pro isn't as big of an issue. However, there will be games, there will be spots where, regardless of how quick he can get the ball out, for example, if he's got a deep drop because they need a big chunk of yards, he's going to need that time. And are the tackles going to stay healthy? We don't know, but that could mean a guy like Carter Warren, who honestly, when he was picked, it was a little bit of a head scratcher for me. Again, not because of the talent level, but because of the position. I expected a tackle. I expected if they were going to take a tackle, they take one earlier. But with Brown and Becton and their durability issues, I think Warren's a good enough player to walk in and become the number 2 tackle. He played both sides in college, so he could be a guy who sees the field this year, or sees the field more than a lot of us anticipated. But linebacker, you don't have a ton of depth there. CJ Mosley, he's an older guy. All pro last year, great, had 50 million tackles. But in terms of guys who can run with backs and track guys down sideline to sideline and cover out of the flat, that's not a thing CJ Mosley does a lot of. I've said before, that's my number one concern coming into this year, at least on the defensive side of the ball, is that when teams need to chip away and pick up yards to either stay in a game or kill the clock, are the Jets going to be able to slow that down when teams try to create mismatches or try to create matchups with CJ Mosley and see, all right, let's see if CJ Mosley can cover this tight end, this athletic tight end, or this running back out of the backfield. Can he do that? I don't know. Zaire Barnes is a guy that some people feel is a rookie who can do that, but is he going to do that year one if CJ Mosley can't? I don't see that happening. Jamie Sherwood. Now he's somewhat of an X factor this year, and we've talked about this. We've talked a lot about Tony Adams and what he brings, and I've said a few times. Dylan Terraman and I did an episode a couple months ago, and I said if I could be a fly on the wall at Florham Park, Jamie Sherwood is one of the guys that I would love to know. I want to know what this team really thinks of him. Do they think he's a guy that if CJ Mosley were to have to miss time or just prove himself ineffective, is Jamie Sherwood ready to step in and play? And if he is, if they believe he is, as we all know, converted safety, more athletic than Mosley at this point, and maybe he is a guy who can step in and spell CJ Mosley if things aren't going well in the middle. But again, that's another area where Joe Douglas he's missed there, or whether we want to say missed, or maybe he's overestimating the ability, or and really this, you know, it was almost a separate episode. I'm kind of combining a couple of different ideas here, but I said a couple of months ago, or at least 6 weeks ago, I said I want to do an episode where we talk about are the Jets as good as the Jets think they are? And that's one that would be my number one criticism of Joe Douglas right now. Having talked about what a great job he's done up to this point, he could have done more. I don't want to talk too much about the Zach Wilson as QB2. I've beaten that to death for a couple of months now. I know other people have said the same thing. I see it on other Twitters and in the forums at Jet Nation. And again, and I said this in the last video I did, you have a segment of the fan base that is so bought into Joe Douglas right now that nothing can be questioned and every move makes sense. How dare you say Zach shouldn't be QB2? Whereas others like myself are saying, I watched him play last year, especially as the year went on and he got worse. I saw him get benched twice. I saw he's not an NFL caliber quarterback right now, and you might be turning your season over to him at some point. Why isn't there a better QB2 in here? So here's my new theory, or here's my new hope, is that the Jets want Zach Wilson to get better. We all do. Nobody wants him to get better more than I do. I've said it a million times. He was my guy coming out of college. He was my pick for that spot. Wanted him to be the QB for this team. They brought him in. He stunk it up. I'm just going to call it like it is. He's been terrible. He's had a couple of moments, but that's been it. But maybe the Jets are saying, look, Zach Wilson, and this is easily, to me anyway, going to be the most interesting thing about this preseason is how many reps Zach Wilson gets, live reps. Jets get the extra game with the Hall of Fame game. So I look at it and say, give him 90% of the reps. Let Aaron Rodgers take a handful of snaps each game, then put him on the bench. Anyone outside of Zach and Aaron Rodgers shouldn't matter this preseason. Get Rodgers, like I said, a few snaps for Rodgers to get comfortable with his guys, get tons of work in practice. They have some joint practices where he can get work and not have to worry about getting hit. But get Zach Wilson on the field for as many reps as you possibly can during the preseason and see what he can do. And listen, I'm not a big proponent, as I've said many times, I'm not a big proponent of handing this team over to Zach Wilson for any extended period of time next year. But if you're going to, then we need to see Zach Wilson take a ton of reps in the preseason. Like I said, 90% of the reps. I don't think that will happen, but that's what should happen. And take everything he has struggled with, all the things he's had a hard time doing, and just have him work on those in live action. And because it's to me, it's the mental stuff, it's the short passing game, it's the bailing on the clean pockets. These are the things that are all in his head. They're not physical. The physical attributes are there. He's got to get the mental part down. Let's see. Charles here says the Jets could have done better in the draft. Could have traded back in the draft. Listen, Charles, I was critical of the draft when it happened, so I'm not going to sit here and say you're wrong. But in the sense that now we can grade the approach. If you want to talk about the approach to the draft, which is what I tend to do immediately after, what is the team trying to do here, or what should they be trying to do? My expectation was you've created a Super Bowl window. The goal should be bringing in as many guys who are going to start right away or contribute in a big way right away. That didn't happen, but so I don't think you're wrong that the approach is wrong. In terms of could they have done better, we got to give it a year or two. Well, really 3 is generally the gold standard, right? A couple years from now, if Will McDonald's, a double-digit sack guy and Izzy Abanikanda has a couple of 800-900 yards under 109, 800 or 900 yard seasons under his belt, then we're not worried about that pick. And there's some guys, like I said, Zaire Barnes, who I mentioned earlier, he's got some physical attributes. Can he play in the league? He's a guy who's going to need some time to develop. Zach Kuntz, right? Look at what this guy, athletic freak. A lot of times those guys don't pan out. But if Zach Kuntz, if they take the time to develop him and give him the time he needs, not rush him along, maybe he's a guy in 3 years. This might be another great draft class. So again, I understand being less than thrilled with the approach that the Jets took, but I'm not going to get down on them. In terms of trying to decide now if they could have done better. They could have approached it differently. But I think I get where you're coming from there, Charles. And again, didn't love it, but for me personally, I kind of backed off a little when I thought to myself that I get what Robert Saleh saying that Joe Tippmann is going to be in a competition for the starting center spot with McGovern, but I really think that's a respect to McGovern thing. I can't see Joe Tippmann not winning this job. I said many times pre-draft he was my number one center in this class. And then after the draft, after Salah's comments, because listen, there is something to be said for experience, veteran leadership, things like that. So McGovern, I wouldn't say there's no chance he starts, but I just think the chances of him starting are far less than 50-50, let's say. So, when Salah made those comments, I kind of viewed it as, well, he has just as good a chance to start as Tippmann. But then I went back again and watched a lot of the highlights and a lot of the game film that I had pulled, and watched a lot of Tippmann and remembered why I had him as my top center, and just kind of said, no, this guy's starting. He's too good not to start. You can't have a guy on your roster that plays that position who moves as well as he does and pull him and not start him. Unless you put him in there and he is just overwhelmed by having to make the offensive calls, or he's struggling to get the calls down and not picking up blitzers, whatever it may be. I can't see a situation where you don't start him. And listen, if he's not starting week one, he's got to be in there some point early in the season. Joe Tippmann just brings too much to the table. He adds too much to an offense to not be your starting center. So, having said, immediately after the draft, they drafted some guys that won't start right away. Looking at it again, and again, the Carter Warren thing, he'll probably get some reps. I mean, look, in a perfect world, he doesn't see the field, because Dwayne Brown and Mekhi Becton both play great and they both play every game, and there's no need for Carter Warren. In the real world, even with their injuries, if Mekhi Becton's injury history wasn't as bad as it is, you're not going to see two tackles. One of them who's 38, 39 years old, another guy as big as Becton. I wouldn't expect to see him under any circumstances. Both of them managed to play 17 games. I don't think that happens. So I think Carter Warren will see the field. Izzy Abanikanda, as we talked about, he's going to spell Breece Hall a little bit early on while Hall comes back, even though Hall's expected to be ready for the start of the season. And we all heard, he's running 22, 23 miles an hour on the treadmill already. That is straight line speed. He will be back. And I just don't think he'll be the Breece Hall we saw early last year. I think he's going to need a little bit of time to be 100%. Jarek Bernard-Converse is an interesting guy. Will he get on the field? There are so many questions at safety, and that the Jets, some people have said, is he going to play corner? Is he going to play safety? I would imagine safety. That's where the Jets listed him on the team website. When I went back and watched him in college, I watched a couple of his games at Oregon State when he was at corner, and he looked pretty damn good. Made some plays on the ball, was able to stay on guys' hip pocket and man coverage. Did a good job deep down the field. Did a good job on breaking on the ball in front of him. So I thought Bernard-Converse looked good at corner, but the Jets obviously view him as a safety. And then, of course, Zach Kuntz, who we mentioned earlier. So all of this, basically, what this comes down to, this year's class is a we don't know yet. We understand they drafted some talented guys. Last year's class is already one of the best we've ever seen as Jets fans. And if, as I said earlier, if Ruckert, if Clemens, if all the guys who didn't get a ton, even Jermaine Johnson, who played last year but didn't get a ton of reps, if we see his reps go on the uptick, if we see Ruckert get on the field and start making plays, Max Mitchell is back. If he continues to make progress, this is easily one of the best drafts in the history of this franchise. And I'm not even saying these guys have to be, that all these guys have to be top level starters or Pro Bowlers. No, you've already got a couple of guys like that in that class. Not everyone's going to get to that level. But if, let's say, Gardner, Wilson, and Hall say they keep playing the way they were, and Jermaine Johnson takes a step up and Ruckert gets on the field and starts making plays, kind of, I think Ruckert is one of the more interesting guys on the roster this year because of the fact that he does bring so much, or at least he at Ohio State, when you watch the way he played there, and a million people have mentioned. I know I think I think it was pre-draft when I said Ruckert's a guy who could be a better pro than a collegian, because he just wasn't a guy who was featured at Ohio State, because every one of their damn receivers is a first round pick. So the tight end kind of goes by the wayside there. But Joe Douglas went out, got himself a bunch of guys who prove they can play, and now a bunch of guys that he took this year who may not get as many reps as we like, but who are highly thought of. Again, McDonald, Tippmann, these are guys that we saw, of course, on One Jets Drive. Tippmann, the Jets staff couldn't say, they couldn't have been more positive about him. They had him rated ahead of guys that we know were drafted in the first round. So he got high grades from the Jets, rightfully so. Joe Douglas has done a phenomenal job. Again, a far from perfect job, but in looking at what he inherited to looking what he's got now, and looking at what hearing and seeing the comments from fans who saying, Joe Douglas has to win this season. Folks, Robert Saleh has to win this season. Joe Douglas has given him the pieces. And this isn't an anti-Saleh thing. I like Saleh a lot. I hope they're both here for the next 20 years. But the fact of the matter is, Joe Douglas's job is to acquire talented players. If you're the owner and you're looking at this roster, you see a lot of talented players. So at that point, winning and losing, that's when it's on the coach. That's how it works. Look, if the owner's looking at the roster and he's talking to people around the league, and he's talking to friends and advisors and former coaches and current coaches, and they're saying, what do your roster stinks? That's why you're not winning. Well, then, yeah, pressure's on the GM. That's when you can say, hey, this team's got to do something this year, or the GM's on his way out. The team this year, you got Aaron Rodgers, you got Garrett Wilson, you got Lazard, you got Hall, you got Abanikanda, unproven, but he's going to be a game breaker in my opinion. You've got O-linemen, granted, as we've mentioned, and we will mention all throughout the year, health is a question, health is a concern. But if those guys are on the field, this team should be putting up video game numbers. I heard Boomer Esiason say the other day he expects Aaron Rodgers to throw 50 touchdown passes. That's a little crazy even for me to imagine. But 40, absolutely. I'm thinking that, I don't know, number that keeps popping into my head when I think, how good can this team be? I keep thinking 42, 43 touchdown passes. I can see it. Again, health is the key. If Aaron Rodgers stays healthy and the tackles stay healthy, the sky's the limit. Sky's absolutely the limit, and that is because of the players that have been put in place by Joe Douglas. So who's under more pressure to win this year? Robert Saleh. It's not even close. Joe Douglas inherited a B-League roster, tore it all down to the foundation, started building it up again, and now has in place a roster that even people who historically bashed the Jets have you've got these people saying, and by these people, really, let's just face it, the media, the national media, who for years they do everything they can to not give credit to this organization. And that's what happens when you're a bad team. The Jets are a bad team in a big market. Like, that's a bad combination because they want those eyeballs, whether it's the NFL Network trying to get viewers or whether it's ESPN.com trying to get some clicks. Like, the best way to do that is to make fans angry. And what better thing to do than pick one of the largest media markets in the world and upset those fans? So let's poke and prod and laugh and make jokes about the Jets. Well, that's what's going to happen until the Jets give them a reason not to. So in terms of pure talent, Joe Douglas has given people a reason not to make fun of the Jets. And I looked at the Super Bowl odds the other day at one of the bookie shops down here out of curiosity, 11-1. They're usually 80. That's the first time I've seen them better than 80-1 in years. So, the expectations are up. Expectations have risen for a reason. The talent has been upgraded. The players are in place. It's now on the coaches to finally make it happen, make this team competitive